Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome all of you and call this meeting to order at 4:01 p.m. on December 18th, 2025. And I believe there's no public comment, so we are going to move right into reports and discussions. And so first, I want to just say thank you to all of you for meeting on this afternoon when we know we've got some pretty crazy weather out there today. As many of you know, we sent students home early today, and the reason we did that is because the county declared a state of emergency as a result of concerns, particularly around flooding. And so they wanted to make sure that we got students home early and get people off the roads and so forth, because as you know, it's raining pretty hard right now, and it's going to continue to spike through this evening. And so in regards to that, at 8 o'clock tonight, we are going to get on a call with the county again and take a look at the weather, take a look at the creek levels, the river levels, and all that kind of thing in order to help inform what we're going to do as of tomorrow. And so more to come. All right. And then I also wanted to just share because, typically I do a capital projects update at this point in time. And so the last time we met, we have not, since the last time we met, we have not held a long range facilities planning committee meeting. But the next one will be on January 21st. And so I will share out following that meeting with all of you. When it comes to some some concerns regarding our buildings at this time, I do want to share. So yesterday morning, as a result of the really high winds on Wednesday night, was it Wednesday night? It was Tuesday night. Get my days mixed up. But anyway, as a result of the really high winds, Westside Elementary had a couple of trees that flipped over and came down over some fencing and across the driveway on the north end of the parking lot and caused damage. And so we had to contract in order to be able to get those trees removed, and we still need to get the stumps removed. I also wanted you to know that at Pine Grove, we have flooding on the lower floor, pretty extensive, like across all the floors. And so tomorrow, Pine Grove staff is going to work from home. The preschool will not hold their preschool there. And Todd Rainwater is working with identifying a contractor to come in and do some work in order to be able to get the water out of there, and then also clean up the mess as a result. Okay. And then third, at Mid Valley, we learned that the fire panel is no longer working, and because of its age, there is not a replacement, and so it's going to take about a week in order to be able to kind of reconfigure that fire panel and get it replaced. And because of that, we have to have someone on fire watch for the next week, which is a pain. And so every evening after the night custodian has left, we need to have someone there walking the school and just keeping an eye on things. And that becomes costly, especially when you're doing that over Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, where there's going to be time and a half paid. So those are just some things that are happening, and anytime you have weather events, typically this is when these types of things show up, because you're putting stress on our schools. So, but I just wanted you all to be in the know when it comes to these concerns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark DeMoss, our CFO. As you may have heard at the board meeting last week, I shared in my superintendent report that Mark and the business team received a clean opinion on the audit for this year. And so really happy about that. And credit to Mark and his team for all the hard work since last spring in order to be able to prepare for and provide the information needed for that audit. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
All right. I sent the report out last night. I think a couple things we're going to go through, and thank you for the thank you, by the way, Bill. We're We're going to go through a few things tonight in addition to just the financial report, and that includes the supplemental budget that we'll file at the January 14th meeting, which I wanted to present tonight so that we didn't necessarily have to take board meeting time to present it unless people had questions about it. And then talk a little bit about budgeting for next year and the projection and what we're seeing as the major variables. So that's sort of the overall theme. In terms of the financial report, just as a summary level at the top, there's really no change. 24-25, it's the same set of adjustments that we're kind of anticipating for last year. The same reserves, the same balance, the 5%. In terms of 25-26, I've given some updated projections. When we populate the supplemental budget, it'll change some of the numbers, but for the most part, we still anticipate ending up with a 5% fund balance. It's just that there's a lot of motion going on with some of the counts and some property taxes and things like that. One thing just to remember is last year, if you recall, and I sort of left this note in here, when we were running in October of last year and November of last year, I guess I should say, the projected fund balance out of forecast 5 was, or the result was like a minus 1.45 million. And so that's always raised consternation because it seems to always project a really big negative early in the year. But our number right now is lower. But I'll explain when we get into detail why I think we should end up sort of on track with the changes we have going on. Let me dive into our discussion. Let's see. I think I got that centered. Let's see. There we go. Starting off with the supplemental budget. For those of you who maybe aren't aware in the budgeting process in Oregon, once we've adopted a budget, we can make certain changes to the budget based upon amounts of change because some of our accounts, specifically contingency, things like that, are being adjusted by greater than 10%. We end up having to do a supplemental budget, which is adopted by the governing board in our case in order to make these adjustments. Essentially right now, this is a list of the changes that are going on. We're going to bring in a higher ending fund balance, 3.8 million versus 3.3 million. The couple things to realize, and I believe I mentioned this last month, but let's just cover it again. There's an extra 468,000 in revenue last year related to the state school fund, which is because Hood River County property tax was higher than the projected number. And if you recall, in the state school fund, regardless of where that property tax number ends up, they just adjust your state school fund balance to come back to the number of the formula. And as a result, even though we brought in more revenue last year in property tax, they'll end up taking it out of this year. And if we're not careful, some districts, they end up thinking they have more money than they really have, and they end up spending it. So part of our supplemental is to reduce this year's state school fund by that amount. It won't happen until May of 2026, because that's just when they do the adjustment for the prior year based upon the audited financials. We'll also bring in we had about $160,000. I'll call it a reserve. We didn't book it as a reserve, but basically it's SIS synergy implementation costs that we took out. We planned on for last year's expense. We're bringing it in, so we're going to add that expense to the appropriation. We're adjusting the revenue for the actual tax certifications. We've had some changes in the ESD pass-through, primarily related to increased costs for nursing, and we're rectifying some various adjustments per the state budget. The big change, and one of the things to realize is the way these budget things go. We're talking about numbers that we put together in like February of last year, February and March. And so when we did our revenue forecast last year, if you recall, based upon indications from the legislature, we anticipated getting an increase in high cost disability, and we didn't. And so that actually reduced that number. And so even though we've offset a lot of that by collecting some other money, some prior year money from the ESD and things like that, but that's all wrapped into those adjustments. In addition, we're going to allocate the $500,000 staffing contingency back to the cost centers. And we're also going to allocate, there's a $512,000 PERS, the legislative adjustment that was reduced the PERS rates for this last year. When we built the budget last year, because that wasn't a certainty, we built it in as a single line item, so we have to adjust it back into each account, and it ends up being about 400 lines of budget change. Anyway, and then we also have a typographical error in the debt service fund that I categorize something as a contingency when it's really a ending fund balance, but that doesn't really affect anything. Sort of in numbers, if you just want to look at it in terms of numbers, this is kind of how it lays out on the expense side. Actually, let me start with our revenue and come back to it. Our revenue goes up. So this local sources changes is because property taxes are going up locally. The intermediate sources is a reduction, primarily related to the ESD contract, and increased nursing costs and some other things. The state source decreases, and it decreases by the amount of that property tax that increases, plus the 468,000 for the prior year adjustment that will end up coming out. Our federal sources goes up a little bit because we've been fortunate. The state recovered some money, or I guess handed out some of the forestry money from prior years on an adjustment. And we also had some lead testing money that's supposed to be coming in shortly. And then I've added a category here, this interfund transfer. That's because in the past, the bus replacement fund, which is not in the general fund, but in a 200 account, that transfer always happened at the end of the year, after the year end, during audit, and nobody ever really looked at it or thought about that in terms of the financial impact that goes on. But that really does come out of general fund expenditure. And so that's based on the transportation grant out of the state school fund. And so I've added that back in to be coming out, because that money goes to a 200 account. And then, so if you look at all of that, the total resource in terms of revenue goes down by 760,000. We're actually bringing in an additional 800,000 in beginning fund balance, which leaves us a net total change of $75,000 on $67 million, which is not a significant change. And then lining out sort of how the appropriation looks like. Remember that the supplemental budget itself is made up of, I don't know, 800 lines of changes spread throughout functions and codes and everything. This instructional decrease is not an actual decrease in instruction cost per se. It's made up primarily of that $500,000 allocation for the PERS legislative reduction. When I booked it in support services, and so now I got to pull it back out, put it there. And so that drives that cost down. So it makes it look like it's decreasing, and it's really not. The staffing contingency, which we're allocating back out, you'll primarily see it in support services, and primarily that's because a lot of our changes occur in those areas, especially in areas like SPED and things like that, where you see increasing costs based upon need after the year starts. And so we're allocating that money out. Debt service fund, this is just a reclassification. Basically, instead of a contingency, it's now going to be shown as an unappropriated ending fund balance, but we have to do that because that's the law. So anyway, that's the supplemental budget. I don't think there's a whole lot there of note, except that I will say from a budgeting process this year, doing the staffing contingency was probably the best decision we made, because it's freed us up to really make good operational decisions without being constrained and having already allocated all of those funds. And so that's the supplemental budget change. Are there any questions on that? It's okay if you don't. In terms of budgeting, I'll just keep reminding this hasn't changed. We're still sort of looking at the same strategy, is to shift to a long-term view. Instead of just looking at 1 year, we got to look at multiple years. We'll continue to do that. And then we're going to start refining this list a little bit more in terms of anticipating long-term changes. As an example, is making sure that as we go into this budget cycle and we look at our costs for next year, that even though enrollment decline is going down, SPED costs are going up. And so there are attributes of the district that require financial resources that go counter to enrollment and things like that. And we need to account for those things first, instead of putting ourselves in a bind after the year starts. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at increased support costs, especially in transportation facilities. Some of this includes difficult to fill positions, bus drivers, things like that. We've got to look at those things and try to address them financially first. And then, as we've talked about, and we will talk about coming up here in the future, the issue of PERS pension impacts, and some of the revenue changes that we anticipate happening because of federal funding. And so this is not really changing. In terms of our risk list, I'm going to go into detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but it really hasn't changed either. And so I'm going to bring us to this Venn diagram. And the purpose here is, if you recall last year when we got into budgeting, we just simply started with scenarios. We said, okay, let's go from a $2.5 million reduction to a $4 million reduction, and we'll just label them scenarios 1, 2, and 3. It's a little bit more complicated this year, especially as we're talking about budgeting right now. And so I'll say, before we develop scenarios, we're going to talk about the critical variables that are out there that's really going to determine, I would say, how big the pie is we have to play with for next year, in the year after. And these are I'll say, the 3 big variables that are out there. And they all have different amounts, they all have different expectations, they all have different timing. And so I want to make sure that the district and everybody involved is very clear on what we're looking at and how we see those tying in. Because probably in January, you're going to see Bill and I present a series of sort of truly built scenarios and scheduling of when those scenarios will be ready. And unfortunately, some of the information to create those scenarios this year isn't going to be available until March, April, May, June, just like it was last year. And so I just want to make sure we manage those expectations. The first variable that's here, and I'll cover it from sort of top right, is this PERS site account expiration. And that's really related to the PERS site account expiration. We've talked about it in some prior meetings, but I've tried to summarize it here. Basically, we presented a projection from previous FAC meetings. I've given a copy of sort of the cover sheet here. And if you recall, what ends up happening is that in 27, 28, when that side account goes away, the problem is we still have to pay on the pension bonds throughout that year. There's also a very good possibility that that side account will expire prior to 7/1 of 27, in which case you'll see PERS costs increase here. There is a benefit, which is, as this side account bond is paid off, it gets paid off. The rate it's a little bit lower in that year, but I think those things are all going to offset, and what we're going to end up with is essentially a very large one-time impact to cash flow in the 27-28 period. And so coming back here, we're estimating that at about 2.6 million. The minimum is pretty much the same, because a big chunk of that at 1.68% is going to happen because the legislative reduction just reverses. It doesn't exist in that year, and the side account will go away. And so there will be, I would say, the next event is at Piper Sandler. It's not Milliman who does the actuarial updates. Some of y'all probably got that email regarding the PERS actuarial valuations and stuff. That doesn't really go into the side account piece. It's kind of outside of the side account. And so Piper Sandler is going to be providing an update probably at the late January COSA OASBO meeting. And so it'll be available in February, which will provide a much more robust calculation of when our individual side account expires and what the expected impact would be. And so that is, this is the exact amount may change, but directionally this is the amount, and it's going to happen. And so we just need to be aware of that. There's one thing that could prevent all of that, and that is if another side account can be established. And so school districts, OASBO is leading an effort. If you recall from prior FAC meetings, in order to create a new side account, there has to be an economic assessment as to the value of the investment, that it can make a return that's greater than the cost of the bond, et cetera, et cetera. And that update takes time to create. And so the likely scenario is, because interest rates are dropping, and remember, sort of the caveat is until interest rates drop into the fours, it's not even, doesn't make sense as an investment vehicle. And so the lower the interest rate is relative then to the cost of the bond, the better the recovery would be. And so they're going to contract, probably with Econ Northwest or somebody like that. They're going to do a rolling forecast and keep it updated. And so all the school districts that want to contribute and potentially have a site account, of which one of them is us, will contribute to this. And so then we will have economic study at our fingertips, ready to go in case we can get a new site of site accounts put into place prior to the expiration of the old site account. So there you go. It's either going to be 500,000 because of the 1.68% that goes away, or it's going to be 2.6 million and kind of nothing in between. Any questions on that? I think I put in the notes somewhere. There is an explanation on the whole site account in the November FAC meeting from last year. If you want to see it, let me know and I'll give you the exact minute so you don't have to go search through it and find it. All right, so back to our chart here. So that's that first, I'll call it the first variable, even though it's the third one on my list. Sorry about that. That's here. The second is the reduction in federal title funding, specifically for us related title grants. But it also, depending on where federal funding goes at the state level, could have a very big impact on the state school fund in future years and biennium because of reductions to Medicaid and things like that. In terms of this, we're really going to try to focus on the federal funding and move the discussion of this impact on state school funds to this area here with state school funding, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. In terms of title funding, and let's start with this slide. There are various proposals out there. I just threw this slide in there because a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of how different all the proposals are between the president, the House, the Senate, etc. However, what in terms of the impact to the district, what it's looking like is that one of the most likely scenarios is that you'll see Title I funding reduced to 80%. You'll see Title II and III funding go to 0. And so if it is simply worked upon that formula, you would see a $600,000 impact to the district. However, our Title I-C is a migrant program, which has been on the sort of the cutting block of the federal government. And if that goes to 0, like with the Title II and Title III funding, it would have a $1.25 million impact to the district. Now, we have internally tried to mitigate some of the title funding issues by removing as many personnel out of the title grants as we can in the general funding, so that it's not commingled, that those efforts are very distinct, and we're trying to make sure that we know where it is. But at the end of the day, those are services and functions that the district is performing. And if that funding goes away, the district would have to make a decision about how to accomplish those things or not accomplish those things based upon the lack of funding. And so that becomes kind of the minimum expected impact, and that would be every year, or the maximum impact. And so with PERS, we have one piece, 500,000, 2.6 million. With title, we have 600,000, 1.2 million. That would kind of come into play starting next year with the federal fiscal cycle. But a lot of this is dependent upon what Congress does with their whole budget. And if they do continuing resolutions, or they're able to pass something, and everyone's guess is as good as mine at this point. The third, yes, Roland.
Has the legislation for the Secure Rural Schools Reauthorization Act had any kind of impact to that? I know that they had passed some stuff that kind of re-upped timber bills, and
yeah, but
is this taking for some of that, or?
Yeah, well, there was some. That's part of that piece about the federal funding, that we had some recovery from the prior years, and at one point we were getting out of that timber, we get an average about 125,000 a year. There was threatened to be reduced to about 48,000 per year. Our piece usually doesn't show up until May, and so we'll see where that ends up. So,
okay,
yeah, it's not significant, I would say. In regards to these proposals from both the House and the Senate, so we are, and when I say we, myself as well as our school board is, writing letters and informing our congressmen, congresswomen, senators to pass the bipartisan Senate proposal, because that is either flat or actually improved funding than the House, which has significant cuts. And so we really want to see that Senate bipartisan proposal be passed.
So as we go into next year, these variables will get kind of put together and we'll figure out what scenarios we plan around. Now, the third, which honestly we are always in this boat of dealing with, but there's two pieces to it this time, which makes it different. The first is the state legislative reductions, which I think we talked a little bit about last meeting. I tried to summarize here. It's a little bit hard because of the way ODE proposed their changes. The state said give us 2.5% and 5% reductions. And so like for the state school fund, they didn't really recommend anything. They just said, hey, here's 0.5% chunks out of the state school fund. But if our state school fund was 53 million, then that's what 2.5% looks like. And that's what a 5% reduction looks like. The pieces that sort of were calculated in there that really kind of hit home is this removal of the local option equalization grant, which there's only about, I think it's 4 districts now that receive it, of which we are one. And one of the ODE proposals was to remove that. And it was a little vague as to whether it was the second year of the biennium or both years of the biennium. But that would obviously be a significant impact. And for all the districts that get it, it's a significant impact. And so we've also reached out to COSA on that. And Bill, I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that effort specifically or.
You bet. So with this, last week we actually had a virtual meeting with the superintendent and the CFOs from Sweet Home, Philomath, and Beaverton, because they are the other districts that are impacted by this possible reduction. And so we kind of, formulated some responses, beginning with this week reaching out to our representatives or state senators that, could help persuade the legislature to not pass this reduction. And so like yesterday, I sent a letter to Representative Helfrich advocating for not touching this local option equalization grant idea and helping them understand that this is something that we put in front of our community when we went out for the actual levy. It was an incentive. And to us, we feel like it's not legal or right to be able to take something that was granted to our community. So we're starting with that. And then we also are fortunate in that we have COSA, their lobbyists on board. And so they are going to be actively working and supporting and having conversations with legislators about this as well. The other nice thing to know about this is that the co-chair on the Ways and Means Committee is also comes from Beaverton. And so this has an impact on, this person's school district. So we feel like that's favorable for our school district.
And so when we're looking at this reduction, we won't really know until next March. I guess really the next big date is the February economic forecast. That will then update where they expect state revenues to be, and then you'd go into legislative time and the discussion about where those go. Obviously, it's the school districts are recommending that we use reserve monies depending on what's going on. And of course, the last economic forecast was not as negative as the prior forecast. And so we'll need to see where that goes in March in order to update where we anticipate this to go.
I was just going to add, and
Yeah.
so, when Mark talks about reserves, there's this education stability fund. It has $1.2 billion in it. And it's been used 9 different times in the state during, challenging times budget wise. And so all school districts, along with COSA, are advocating for the use of the stability fund in order to ensure that school districts remain untouched for this biennium.
Yes, Garrett.
Mark, did you tell us or remind us when we typically get those forecasts on the title dollars? Is that like May? where they tell us how much we're actually getting for those?
I'm sorry, you broke up on my computer when you asked that.
Can you remind us when we find out about the title funds?
Well, so usually, we find out in order time for sort of the June cycle, but you know, they were still debating those amounts really into this year, and ended up continuing, CRing some of that to move forward. So it's possible that they could, you know, reach a budget anytime if they wanted to. But you're following sort of the federal fiscal cycle now, and when those things lapse, are they going to actually pass a budget or not? And you can kind of Google that and see government's been under continuing resolution for years and years now. And so it's hard to me. I think it's very hard to say when we would know.
Okay, and then my second question was around right now we're receiving funds through the EL Outcomes grant. Is that
Yes.
something that would potentially be tied, even though it's a state grant? Would that be tied to federal funds going to them that might dissipate in some function, or do you feel like that's pretty secure?
Um, I think I think where all state funding will come into play is certainly the start of the next biennium. The issue right now is, I think, part of this entire effort around the ODE reductions, or the state legislature asking ODE to come up with reductions, is related to all of this funding and pass through. Whether there are specific line items that affect other grants, I actually haven't heard a lot on that specifically. I think it's sort of being tackled at a state sort of broader level. That probably doesn't
No,
answer your question
yeah,
specifically.
I'll add, I don't recall Garrett seeing the EL Outcomes grant on the ODE's 2.5% to 5% reduction list that they had to
Yeah.
propose in November. So I think for this biennium, we're okay. But like Mark said, I think anything could possibly be on the table for the next biennium, and that's a wait and see.
For the state school fund, and I realize it's like I haven't heard hardly any discussion about anybody talking about it for the next biennium yet. So all I wanted to do was throw some data out there, which was I went and pulled the state school fund amount by year and the average increase. And what surprised me was kind of just how volatile that increase really is. And so I took the average since 2000 is about 7.28. But when you look at it, the low was in 2009 to 2000, I should say 11, not 2001. The low was a negative 1.7, and the high, was 15%, just a few years later in 13 and 14. Last year was 10.8. And so if you sort of take those increases and divide by 2, you get sort of a rough annualized kind of a number for the increase. I think the issue for us is that swing is such a wide swing. It's very like trying to extrapolate and determine where that biennium is going to be is very difficult. And that trying to assume what kind of number will go in there is also very difficult. And so I think we have to be on guard and we have to be careful. And so, whether we get an indication or something is coming through legislation of what it looks like for the following year may or may not happen, right? And so whether we are cautious about what type of expected increase, I think the point being we have to be careful that it's probably on the lower side, not on the higher side right now, that you're not going to see something like this year. And so we're just going to need to be careful. And that then ties in as we are talking all of our cost structures, our labor contracts, our increases, cost increases, is be very aware of them, because if they outstrip that number, ultimately the balloon is only so big. And since 80% of our cost structure is people, it's either number of people and rate cost per person, and it makes it very hard. And so a lot of our initiatives of areas that we want to try to tackle this year that we've talked about in terms of SPED or things like that, they're going to require money. And so as we're going into this forecasting, all I wanted to do was to try to relate the fact that this whole state school fund as a variable is actually pretty volatile. And the feeling of where we're going to end up in 27, 29, we certainly know that as we do our scenarios, we need to tackle this PERS piece because we know what it is. We probably need to tackle the federal funding piece and just have a plan and know what that is. Hopefully, come March, we'll get good news on this legislative reduction piece, and then we'll decide what to tackle. And the reason being is obviously if you have to reduce $1 million, it's easier to reduce $500,000 in 2 years than it is $1 million in a single year. And so that's where we're trying to figure out where all of these sort of variables, vectors, whatever you want to call them, end up going. And so the purpose here was to sort of show this and then how we then respond to budget cuts. And so this is sort of taking a COSA training seminar slide that they put together. We may come up with something very similar that sort of shows, hey, here's levels. And so in terms of budget reduction or savings, target savings needed, there's a significant difference between a 2% cut and a 6% cut. And so, you know, what those numbers are. And I think one of the things to realize is the $4 million budget cut that we went through this year, it was in this 6% plus category. And so that was a fairly significant one. And so we sort of have these things at our discretion of trying, you know, starting with sort of easier things, removing discretionary contracted services and dealing with vacancies and freezes and things like that. And you go all the way up to furlough days and salary freezes and things like that. So we will try in our planning to put something together and talk about how these play in. But when it comes to designing a district, you know, there's only so many variables we get to work with. Class size we get to work with. Unfortunately, that always seems to suffer. But, you know, when we're talking about cuts and things like that. But, you know, we've seen other districts already out there have begun talking about probable cuts. So I don't think we're alone in terms of certainly the PERS piece. Everybody's aware of that piece, but trying to understand where these others go. And so as we do that, I took all of these maximums and minimums, and I realized these numbers get so big, but it's indicative of where we're at. And so because there's timing changes and maximums and minimums, we tried to put this chart together that says, let's look at 25, 26, 26, 27, 27, 28, the minimum cut that we'd see, sort of a median number, and all of those variables, we have calculations on it. I didn't throw them all in here. This is a summative of all those things. And then what we think the maximum cut might be. And so for example, 25, 26, the 752, that's pretty much that local option levy reduction that the ODE threw into their reduction list. Doesn't mean it will happen, but it's out there. And so then extrapolating it back to a percentage of revenue, you see that, hey, like we are likely in sort of the minimum threshold, we're going to be at kind of 3% over 2 years, no matter what happens. Obviously, if you had a massive state school fund cut of like 5% less than the expected norm in the 27-29 biennium, that would add to that cut, and you'd see this sort of 15% level, which would be a huge level. And so all we're trying to do here is just note, call it a sensitivity analysis, call it risk management, how wide the range is in terms of all of these things and where these outcomes are. And so we're going to do our best to try to crystallize these things. My attempt today was not really necessarily to try to say, here's what these numbers specifically are going to be, because I don't think we will know. And so that's where on this list, these sort of next timing issues, like waiting for the February report, and then March's legislative funding, those sort of things. Those things are going to lead us into understanding what those things are. However, it is probably true that just like we had last year where we had multiple scenarios based upon percentages, is probably going to be a very similar strategy this year, because of the fact that we just don't know any one of these variables could change this number, and we need to be prepared for all of these cases. And so we'll probably see it on some, you know, here's these scenarios. This is what we anticipate working with, and we'll present those next year. Okay, I threw out a whole bunch of information there. So does anybody have any questions? And feel free to email me and ask something and we'll add something. Okay. I wanted to add another piece to this discussion. So when we did the last board meeting, we talked a little bit about athletic fees, and it sort of came up, but we didn't really get a chance to go in depth on it. And we had pulled some information, and I think it's worth sharing. The athletic fees, in terms of if you recall, our policy is just 150 per sport for a maximum of 2 sports, and we began it last year. Last year at the high school, I didn't put the middle school numbers there, but at the high school we collected 64,000 total. Fees are waived or reduced automatically based upon income data from the registration system. And last year, 57% of our students received some form of financial assistance on those fees. The important thing here, and this is what I wanted to try to make sure everyone is aware of, if you take a cost per participant or registration, so if I'm a student and I play 2 sports, that counts as 2 registrations. The cost of that per registration is almost $900, and that's without the athletic director and really the full transportation costs in there. And so when we talk about collecting $150 sport fee, it doesn't cover the cost of all the sports. The middle school is sort of the same way. It's about 3 to 1, and that's as opposed to 6 to 1, and that's primarily because you don't have as much transport, you don't have as long of seasons, that kind of stuff, and so those costs are lower. And the one way to sort of just conceptualize it is our district has as a value decision has said, hey, we're going to run more teams, we're going to increase participation and that sort of thing, which is good. But if you have a team of 20 and you require a $10,000 coaching stipend, that's already $500 per participant. And so you can't cover it with your athletic fees. And so as these programs and sports and things get added, or we try to extend teams and things like that, those costs put an impact on our general fund, because that's where that is, unless we try to fundraise around it. And so I just wanted to point out those numbers, because I think as we get into planning and we start talking about things, it's important to know that those things are not, like middle school sports is not a requirement for the district, but it's based on our values. And that athletic budget and fees barely cover program costs. They're certainly not going to cost. And so this is really one of the things that sort of came up at the high school is you know, when Sean Maley, the athletic director, is making decisions, he's the athletic fees are not going to go pay for all the capital equipment. And so as we're talking about long range facilities planning and that effort, you know, it's not just facilities at the high school, it's facilities at the middle schools. All of these program costs add up, and we want to try to extrapolate what those things need to be, so that we're really not putting ourselves in a dilemma with equipment and underfunding programs, because that's difficult too. And so I think just awareness of these numbers as we're going through budgetary was really all we wanted to put here. Are there any questions on the athletic fee discussion? Okay. In terms of the financial report, as usual, and I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on it this time, kind of like the past, is primarily because we have a supplemental budget coming in. If we take forecast 5, this is the raw data. I think the more helpful report is here, where I've gone in and made adjustments, because I went ahead and sort of hand manipulated the data to pull out the staffing contingency back to these accounts. And the importance here is if you look at the way forecast 5 is forecasting it, these numbers were heavily negative at this time last year. And so I think we've done a good job of forecasting those costs. When we do the supplemental, we're going to address some of the areas in that supplemental related to other pay and increased costs in those areas, and we've allocated some things to them. When it comes to sort of expenditures on purchase service, supplies and materials, we don't anticipate, we've done some pretty heavy purchasing up front. In here is the Synergy $160,000 program cost to do our implementation and development, that sort of thing. And so those show as increased cost in terms of the projection early on. We don't think that will maintain it. And so I fully expect after we're done with our supplemental and done with the year, we'll have a lot of changes going on, but we'll end up at our 5% funding level. And so that's sort of the message I want to send here without necessarily diving into numbers in significant detail, because we've already talked about a lot of them. In terms of special revenue funds, it's a similar picture to prior years. I will point out our expenses are higher this year, and it's primarily related to summer school, which is about $500,000, which I think we just got the check this week. So that money came in. We also have made some significant purchases related to the buses on grants, because we had received EPA funds and state of Oregon funds for bus repairs. And we made those purchases because by spending those monies up front, we could then qualify for some of the expiring federal credits on electric vehicles and try to collect that money next year. So I think we're in a healthy place in terms of our grant funds. In terms of our debt service funds, it's sort of the same thing you see in the past. The only thing I'll say is it has a shortfall in terms of where it was last year, but that's just related, for some reason, Hood River property tax, when November is the big month, and sometimes the last payment comes in December, so it shows in December, and that's just kind of what happened this month. And so the timing's off. I think when we get to the January report using December numbers, it'll be all on track and it will look right. But there's no expected changes there. And on capital projects, we'll continue to watch this. I think there is a little bit of weakness in some of the construction excise tax, but that's a pretty volatile number that changes based on what projects are going on. And so you can't always project it. But we don't plan to spend that money in excess. We don't have commitments on these funds. And so we spend the money as it's available. Let's see. The variance report is in here if you want to read it. I've also attached the staffing report. You do sort of see that sort of this is the effect from one year to the next of staffing reductions, total headcount, because the cost per employee has gone up. But you do see the reductions in all of these areas, which you'd expect to see, except for classified, which has gone up because that's a place where we've had the most need over the last year. And then I've included the board report. If anybody has any questions on it, I'll be free to answer them, but it's a lot of numbers. And I think at a board level, the most important thing is I think we are on track for this year. Assuming the state doesn't cut our funds in the middle of the year. Any questions? Well, yes, Randy.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say I appreciate all your pre-planning and looking at everything and having so many different scenarios, trying to look ahead and plan as best you can. I know that's a lot of work and extra work, but really appreciate that from you and your team. So thank you.
Yeah, I will say, having talked to some other people, I think our district, I think Bill as a superintendent has a very good sense about needing to do this, which is really good. I don't have to be at odds with my superintendent. Some other districts, it's not so jivey that way. So we're trying to stay in sync and really just, have a plan for each level and do the best we can. So.
Yeah, and Brandy, at the January 14th board meeting, it's Mark and I will be getting in front of you and just talking to you about the budget timeline and process that will be playing out over the next several months. There are other questions? Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, then I am going to conclude our meeting at 4:50 p.m. And I hope all of you have a nice, warm, dry evening tonight. And if I don't talk to you, I hope you also have a really safe and enjoyable holiday, relaxing holiday with your family and friends. So with that, we'll close the meeting. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.